Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining Hartley House for our program called The Unspoken War. My name is Caroline Dado, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a part of the Community Engagement and Prevention team here at Hartley House, along with my coworker, Allie Albrecht, who you'll be introduced to later. A quick content warning before we get started. We will be discussing instances of sexual violence. If you or a loved one is a survivor or a survivor supporter and needs to speak to a trained professional, we have a 24-hour hotline with the number at the bottom of the screen. You can talk to figure out a safety plan or just if you're feeling overwhelmed and are not sure what to do with those emotions. Just a background on the Unspoken War. With Veterans Day right around the corner, Hartley House wished to sit down with a few of our community veterans to hear their account of sexual violence within the military. And today's discussion will facilitate understanding of sexual violence within the military, learn different barriers to reporting sexual violence, and discuss how individuals can preserve their patriotism after a sexual violence incident. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest, Mary Kate Soliva. Mary Kate Soliva is a Pacific Islander Chamorro descent pursuing a Doctorate of Criminal Justice degree at St. Leo University, where she currently serves as president of the Student Veterans of American. She is an Army veteran with 12 years of combined experience. A business development analyst at the Project Management Institute, she provides strong advocacy to empower change makers and improve care for veterans, women, and survivors of human trafficking. She is a U.S. Army Reserve soldier in the 312th Psychological Operations Company. She is a public speaker and has trained the public, military, and law enforcement in the U.S. and abroad on the signs and impact of human trafficking. Her efforts include working with local policymakers, government agencies, host to national leaders, and nonprofit organizations to change policy and impact change. Mary Kate is a member of the Rotary E Club of Pago Bay, Guam, and volunteers for Veterans to Industry, Shared Hope International, and numerous other organizations. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree and Master of Public Administration degree from the University of Guam, where she focused her studies on human trafficking in Guam and Micronesia. Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to talk with you about these important issues.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Mary Kate. We are so happy that you were able to join us today. So, as we heard in your bio, you are a veteran of the Army. Just to kind of jump into this discussion, could you explain from your perspective how prevalent you believe that sexual violence is within the armed services at large?
Yes, I will throw out that little disclaimer that these are of my own opinions and thoughts, not the Department of Defense. But I will say that as a veteran in my time in military service, I do think that it is something that is prevalent and it's an important topic on our national leaders' minds, especially military sexual trauma. You may hear it in the news as MST, but I do think that it is something that is an important issue that our leaders need to be pay more mind to, because you'll see numbers out there regarding how many survivors or known reports are out there, but my real concern are those that go unreported. And nearly 1 in 4 U.S. servicewomen report being sexually assaulted just this past year alone. And there's still numbers out there about how many actually feel that they're going to be retaliated against. And so yes, there was actually my first year in the military. I experienced a sexual harassment, and it was something where when I did decide to go forward with my leader, the response that I got was, "Are you sure that it happened?" And so that was just early on in my young adult life, early on in my military career, and I did feel that retaliation just amongst my own colleagues and fellow service members, where they didn't quite understand or believe, and then alleged offender would just go around and say I was lying. So it was something where I think early on, if I had had that support system from my leadership and from fellow service members, understanding that I wouldn't have felt so ashamed, because of course anything that was remotely like that, I'm thinking at a young age, no, I can't come forward because no one's going to believe me, or there's going to be some sort of retaliation from either my command or just my own peers. And that was more from just the harassment. So let alone having dear friends of mine who've experienced sexual assault in the military, they've expressed the similar sentiments, that they were afraid to come forward, and especially not understanding the process of what they have access to.
So, could you speak a little bit to, I guess, the culture in which allows for people to feel as though it's appropriate to retaliate against someone who decides to come forward after they've experienced abuse or assault? Like, what is that kind of environment like?
As far as the culture within the units,
Yes.
so we do have training, but I do think that the culture in some settings, mind you, that there's 6 branches of our military, and I have noticed that even between the reserves, the National Guard, and active duty, there are some differences in just culture. Because for reserves and guard, for example, they only meet once a month,
Mhm.
2 weeks out of the year, whereas the active duty, it's an everyday, full time. But just even in the different stresses of the job, for mine in particular, um, as the experience that I had early on in my career, the culture was, it was definitely tough, because I felt like we were really tight knit. We go through a lot of the similar experiences, whether that's basic training, we're going through intense training, or overnight 24-hour duties, or we're out in the range together. And
Mhm.
so having that brother sisterhood, it's hard when it can break that apart. Having an experience of sexual assault or sexual harassment can definitely create a breakdown in morale, and also tear it apart from the inside, as far as just how we work together, because you sort of lose that sense of, we trust one another, we put our lives on the line for one another, but then it can all fall apart in just that one instant.
So hard to deal with, and I'm sure you think that you're surrounded by people who care about you, and like you said, will put their life on the line for you, and then when something happens, that kind of is taken away from you. Do you think that that's a main barrier as to why someone might not come forward after they've experienced assault or abuse?
I know for at least for me, I definitely was concerned about coming forward, because I wasn't sure if I was going to get believed. And of course, the worst nightmare came about, where he was yelled at and scolded, but nothing really happened. I still ended up having to see him. Now, that's not always the case with the Sharp program. They will relocate survivors, like who do come forward and report. There is a process available to relocate them to a different duty station. But it's not always the case, and just even from mine early on. But I do think since then, we've made a lot of strides forward in getting better care available, more resources available, and even the training is more frequent, in especially at different locations, to educate service members about sexual harassment, sexual assault. Um, I will add that I think for leaders in particularly, one question that I tend to like to ask at the end of sharp training is, what is the process for leaders? What does that conversation look like if a survivor does come forward and say, this is what happened to me? What are some of the responses that they say in return? Because for what I experience, having that response, "Are you sure that happened?" is not necessarily the best one to feel comfortable enough to say anything further after that. And granted that it's not going to be the same every time, but it is something that I think, from a service member's point of wanting to feel comfortable enough to come forward, I think it's important that they know where their leaders stand in supporting them, even having that what if, instead of waiting for after it happens and then finding out what the process is, but to know ahead of time as a leader, and to subordinate to leader, to understand that process and what that looks like.
Absolutely. Now, do all leaders go through this type of training? Is it a mandatory thing for all of them?
Yes, it's mandatory, and I have been informed that leaders do go through their own training as well, how to manage
Mhm.
and handle those cases, and they are getting legal guidance and support as well to be able to manage it. But you may have seen in the news that there is conversation about how much military leaders should have as far as the decision being, for lack of terms, like the judge and jury on a certain case, because military sexual trauma is something that can negatively will negatively impact a command. And so seeing whether our leaders are equipped and able to make those decisions, or should it be strictly outside of the unit, outside of the command, and maybe a civilian entity making those decisions. So there's a lot of conversation going on, and I know we have our nation's leaders heavily on this topic as well. So I think that, again, we're making huge strides from when I first entered service.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to go back to what you were saying about, the not being believed after you experience an assault. What were some other barriers as to how you got support or felt in your command, going forward?
Oh, and I will clarify that it was harassment more so.
Oh,
But what as far as the support that I felt like I felt afterwards was going to those few that of my closest friends that I felt like were able to support me at that time, because we're not always in a position to where we can just go home.
mhm.
I was in a training environment at the time, so I was in a schoolhouse and not where I was going home every day to my family. So it in those circumstances, or if it happens while you're deployed and you're in a different country, it makes it even more challenging because you can't just go to your family physically and see them. So for me, I leaned heavily on my friends at the time and for their support, which is why I think the training is so important for everybody across the board, not just even recognizing, but even just being better equipped to be able to help our brothers and sisters in arms if they do come forward to us, and to understand what that process, what next steps are for them, and just how to best handle and support what they're going through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. As a nation, what do you think that leaders need to do first, like first thing first, to reduce the amount of sexual assaults and harassments and cases of that nature in our military?
I think that that's something that we're making huge strides again and taking care of. But first and foremost is, I think they need to make sure they're taking care of their service members, instead of making the training a check in the box. Look for opportunities. I think Hartley House, as you all are just even having this discussion now, there are organizations across the country and even at locations that are overseas installations that can come at no cost to the military to be able to provide additional training, or even to bring in survivors who are willing to speak out about what's happened to them. I think that it's more than just having I like seeing more leaders having these conversations. It's not just a PowerPoint that they're running through and that's the end of it. It's not just a virtual training that we're clicking through and getting the certification at the end, but there's real conversations happening now. And I know for at least the leaders I've had throughout the rest of my career since that incident have actually been very supportive, and that's what I see is them being as an approachable leader, that if something like this was to happen again, that I know that I can go to them. And I especially think that it's important for leaders to keep an eye on for the junior service members too, the junior enlisted, the ones who are might be the first time away from home, or they're just coming out and into service and they're still really young. I think there's a I just think it could happen to anybody at any age, any background, but I especially think that the younger ones are vulnerable, just in my opinion, to that.
Mhm.
Like I said, it happened early on to me when I first joined the military, and so I think we're a lot more susceptible to those things happening.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that perspective. So, could you speak to maybe some of what you're doing as a reserves member for, supporting this community and making those strides?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So for my unit, like we actually just had this training last drill, so the sharp training. So Um, it was really beneficial. I think my leadership did a great job. And this isn't a shameless plug because they might be listening, but I do appreciate that they took the time to have an actual conversation. They brought all of us in the room, officers and enlisted, uh, different ranks, different levels, different backgrounds. We were all there to just listen and have it was a two-way conversation. I was seeing at different ranks were asking questions for clarity on having a restricted report versus an unrestricted report, if they can go to the chaplains, if they can go to the commanders, what that would look like, what would they say in return if we were to speak out. So there was a lot of great questions being asked, a lot of great conversation. And that's just something that I keep an eye on, because if that wasn't happening, that's something I would have spoken out about and saying, what more are we doing? The other thing is, since I'm really passionate about combating sex trafficking, that's another one that I I was working with my last unit to add that on. Is even though it should be separate in its own thing, we already sit down and have conversations about sharp. That it's also something I'm working on to see if we have more of those conversations about sex trafficking as well. But again, it's just more of keeping an eye out that if service members are out there, if you're realizing that your unit is not doing it, or you don't think that you think that more could be done, or you'd like to see about bringing in speakers, to not be afraid to speak to your command team about other opportunities that could be more beneficial to make the most of that training. You don't want it to everybody to just have eyes glazed over. These are real important topics. They're topics that are hard to talk about. They're not easy to talk about all the time, especially I've been in classes when survivors have spoken out about what's happened to them. I have been in a class where a sharp class where somebody who had been who was a victim of sexual assault speak up about what happened to her, and to just be create a setting and an environment where service members feel comfortable enough to come forward. So that's why I keep an eye on, and if it's not happening, that's when I really do speak up. So I
Thank you so
encourage everybody
much.
else listening today to do the same.
Thank you so much, Mary Kate. This is such a great perspective to have. Could you speak to any services that are able to be utilized by veterans who might not be active military anymore, or any systems that might be able to support them?
Oh yes, and I will say that just as a whole, there's over 45,000 veteran service organizations out there that help for different causes, like we mentioned earlier before, about homelessness, tackling that as well. Even in shelters out there that will assist with both children and the veteran. But I do think that there's your your advocates. You should look in your local community for organizations out there that will help survivors, because there's amongst Hartley House, so you all are in Frederick County,
Mhm.
just being aware that Fort Detrick is right there. And I think it's important that service members at Detrick know that you all exist, know that there's organizations out there that exist. I know some folks are afraid to come forward even to law enforcement. But there is, if it is an emergency situation, to make sure that you call 911 and get a hold of your, just don't just call your friend, because I have been in situations where my friends have wanted to just call another friend, and when it really was a 911 situation.
Mhm.
So I don't want to, I guess, throw out one generalized organization out there that can cover, because I don't think it's a one size fits all. I think it really does depend on your circumstance. But what I encourage, especially leaders, to do is when you're going to give and to prepare that sharp training, that you look for those local organizations outside of your US base or your camp installation, whatever it is, and find out what is available. And I will say that even connecting with you all at Hartley House, that I haven't been turned away yet. As a veteran, when I reach out to a nonprofit organization, they're like, yes, we've been waiting for an opportunity to connect with the military community. What more can we do? So for those listening in today, to just know that the nonprofits are absolutely incredible in what they do, and to just volunteer, get involved, and then to find a way to bring them on base, because they really do have a plethora of resources available.
Thank you so much, Mary Kate, for your time, for your insight, and for all of this information. We are so appreciative that you were able to join us tonight. And if anyone has any questions for Mary Kate, please feel free to drop them in the comments. But thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I do want to say Happy Veterans Day to everyone. Thank you.
Fort Detrick is a pivotal part of the Frederick community. Service members, veterans, and their families have dedicated their livelihood to protecting this community and this country. At Fort Detrick, the SHARP program is dedicated to supporting soldiers and active service members by providing sexual assault and harassment prevention trainings and providing support and assistance to service members who have experienced sexual violence during their service. We have listed on the screen the contact information specific to Fort Detrick SHARP program. If you or a loved one has experienced sexual assault or harassment on base, this is a great resource to get support, resources, and information on reporting on base. For any other veterans or active service members outside of Frederick County, we have listed on the screen the hotline for the DoD SAFE hotline as well. We at Hartley House are also able to provide services to active and retired service members and their families who reside within Frederick County. To receive confidential support through Hartley House, please contact us via our 24-hour hotline, which is listed at the bottom of the screen. And if you have trouble reading that, please remember it is 301 662 8800. And here we have a list of other resources and hotlines for a more national community. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see our hotline number, as well as the National Domestic Violence Hotline number and the number for RAIN. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a list of online resources that you can use to further educate yourself and get more support. Again, if you are in need of assistance, please contact our 24-hour hotline listed at the bottom of the screen. Again, that number is 301 662 8800.
So thank you again, Allie, for conducting the interview questions, and a huge thank you to all of our guests tonight for taking the time to discuss sexual violence as it pertains to the military and to veterans with Hartley House. I know talking about these issues and this topic in general can be very difficult, so we really appreciate your courage to have these types of conversations. And then lastly, thank you so much for your service to our country, and happy Veterans Day to you guys, because you all deserve it. And for those who have not heard of Hartley House prior to this video, welcome. We support survivors of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, child abuse, and human trafficking in the Frederick County, Maryland area. As previously mentioned, we have a 24-hour hotline for survivors and their supporters. And if you are interested in any of our services, please feel free to give us a call at the number below on the screen. If you would like to learn more about our work, you can head to our website, www.hartleyhouse.org, or you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Hartley House for more information. Thank you so much and have a wonderful night.